Welcome to Sons of Patriarchy, a podcast devoted to understanding how men and women get caught up in the systems of patriarchy, Christian nationalism, and the far right. For years, these have been on the fringe, but now they're mainstream. They've come from places like Moscow, Idaho, and are influencing churches, families, schools, marriages, and institutions across the country, and now in Washington, D.C. Every Monday, I interview experts in the fields we focus on, whether they be authors, reporters, other podcasters, academics, professors, former members of these groups, and more. Our companion podcast, They Called Her Bitter, amplifies the stories of survivors and the advocates who come around them, detailing how the ideas we talk about here impact real lives. Because what was done in the dark will be dragged in the light. Today we talk to Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss, who is an American sociologist, educator, and leading expert on political extremism, radicalization, polarization, and violence. She serves as a professor in the School of Public Affairs and the School of Education at American University in Washington, D.C., and is a founding director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, a research and practice hub focused on understanding and preventing extremist radicalization and hate-fueled violence through evidence-based interventions. She has written Hate in the Homeland, The Extreme Gone Mainstream, and Man Up. In this episode, we discuss far-right ideologies, how gender norms are policed in these circles, the fear of replacement via immigration, anti-Semitism, meme culture, the sense of brotherhood cultivated, how and why women are drawn to these movements, and how loneliness and isolation are exacerbated by these online communities. Let's get into it. All right, we've got another guest coming on, Cynthia Miller-Idriss, and please do correct me if I'm wrong on my pronunciation of your last name. And we do. Perfect. Okay, I was really hoping I got this one wrong because honestly, I was thinking about this 10 minutes before the recording. When I heard your name, when I saw your name, when I was reading up on your stuff, I was like, her name reminds me of something, and I couldn't pin it until I remembered Idris Elba.
I know, that's what I always tell people, just like Idris Elba, just two S's.
I was really curious, like, do I know her? It's like, no, It's because I know Idris Elba.
That's right.
And I was like, oh, the last name is the same as his first name.
That's exactly how you say it. Yep.
Okay. Perfect. All right. So now people know Idris Elba, Cynthia Miller-Idriss. So I gave everybody sort of a pre idea of how to spell or how to pronounce your name. But yeah, you're coming on for far right ideologies and far right movements and radicalization. People have heard some of your stuff and your books that you've written and where you're a professor at and all the other fun stuff that you're part of in the intro to this episode. But thanks for coming on Sons of Patriarchy to talk about your research.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So the obligatory first question that you are probably asked, and we ask everybody else, what got Cynthia into researching all of the fun, misogynistic, and far-right ideologies and political, like what did young Cynthia think, or how did she get into this stuff? Because this is not just something like you grow up as a little girl thinking like, I really want to talk about far-right ideologies when I grow up.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a complete accident. It was not intentional at all. I was a German major in college, and I went and studied abroad in Germany, and I took a class that was about the education system there, and I got really interested in the vocational system and in this idea that there was a pathway to adulthood, particularly for young men, that didn't involve college, that was still highly regarded. Because my older brother had dropped out of high school, and I saw him struggle, and I saw guys like him struggle, and I thought, this is really interesting. Like, it never occurred to me that a society could just structure its whole education system differently, and that it could work out differently for kids who didn't go to college. And so I ended up studying that, and I worked in it for a while. Bill Clinton had tried to create this School to Work Opportunities Act back in the 90s to try to bring that system to the U.S. So I was like a young little DC person trying to do that. And then I went back to grad school and decided to study it. And when I was studying, got there to do 18 months of field work in Berlin in a construction trade school, an IT school, and a hotel school. The construction trade school happened to have a couple of occupations there, like scaffold builders and concrete layers and those kinds of jobs. These guys were there for 3.5 years, and they had civics classes that were required. So I was in the civics classes with the teachers trying to understand how they're learning about democracy, all kinds of stuff. And like 85% of them, sometimes in some of the classrooms, had shaved heads and bomber jackets and combat boots that were at that time the real visual identification of a racist skinhead. And there had been this uptick in far right extremism. And so I ended up just accidentally becoming an expert on school-based responses to resurgent neo-Nazism and far-right extremism. And I ended up writing 2 books about those schools, like about the change in over like a decade, about how they changed the modernization of the scene as it moved into different kinds of iconography and symbols. And then eventually that became memes. And so by the time Charlottesville happened in the US, I still thought I was like really a nerdy area studies scholar who just was like talking
Yeah.
to other comparative education professors.
Yeah,
I
not
did
any
not
longer.
think, right? Like I had no relevance, I thought. And so that really changed. And I knew something about how young men in particular in the global online far right youth scene were communicating with each other. And so that sort of changed the rest of my trajectory. And I started working more on the far right in the US.
I mean, just a like studying this in the night, and it's so I want to go back to your Germany and German stuff because I have to mention that plays into a lot of stuff even to but like thinking about the 90s and 2000, did you at all think, okay, today in the year of our Lord 2026 is um presidential affiliated and governmental websites and social media platforms and high up officials will not just be parroting far right memes, they'll be creating far right memes.
Yeah. No, never. I mean, I would say that like there were many waves of things that surprised me over the past 10 years. Like it's been almost 10 years since Charlottesville, which is crazy, like 9
Yeah.
years this year.
17, that's right. Yep.
So it's been almost a decade that I've been kind of working on this in the US context. And just when you think that like something can't surprise you more, like it was really surprising to see young men not with their faces covered in like khakis and polo shirts, looking very clean cut, walking across a university campus chanting, Jews will not replace us, right? Like that was super surprising at the time. That was shocking, that kind of mainstreaming, but it was still in the end on the fringes, right? That was still the fringes. I think what we're seeing now is like, that's just, it's not on the fringes. It's right in the middle of advertisements that come out that say, you'll have your home again, right? And, or like
Right.
Western iconography, right? These kinds
Yep.
of, not even dog whistles, they're just whistles. And so it's just like,
Not even whistles.
it's,
They're shouting at each other like, "Hey,
yeah,
what you
right?
guys
Like
think
it's,
is was below the surface is now actually above the surface, and we're letting
yeah,
you know
right. The
right in front of your
quiet
face."
part's out loud, right? There's no more, the gloves are off. Like, so that, but it's like just when you think you can't be surprised anymore, you are surprised. I was surprised to hear Pete Hegseth say, we need male standards in the military. Like, I didn't think people would say that kind of stuff, right? And so, and it just did. It's people just say it now.
That's true. Yeah. So so studying German, so did you study the German language and then Germany as well?
Yeah, so I was originally like a very nerdy German literature scholar, right? Like I was poetry, like, Goethe, Schiller, anybody who knows any of that old German
Oh yeah.
poetry, like that's what I was doing. And I go off and I randomly take this this education class, and my whole life, shifts. And I just got really interested in that more practical side of things. And still, I'm sure my parents were like, what in the world are you going to do with a German major? Like this tells you like there are things you can do with like, language majors. And then, yeah, and then I'll just say like this other part that we're talking about, which is the misogyny. I opened my most recent book, and this is my 7th book, my 4th sole authored book
Man
I've
up, you're
written.
talking about, correct?
Yeah, Man Up, right, exactly. I have never really addressed the issue of misogyny or gender-based violence. I talk a lot about masculinity. I interview boys and men my whole life in my career, and I talk a lot about the way they talk about like brotherhood and belonging and why they would be a part of these kinds of groups and the pressure they feel to be violent or to be ready to be violent at any time, that kind of stuff. But I never asked them about how they have treated women or how men in their lives have treated the women in their lives, or their views on gender, or how they were bullied themselves, like homophobic bullying or, being called a sissy or all kinds of things. So that it was a really belated awareness for myself. It was a real blind spot myself. And I think that's really important to say. Like, our whole field has ignored it in the national security side, the connections between gender, misogyny, gender-based violence, domestic violence. 60% of mass shooters have a history of domestic violence as a criminal background, that kind of stuff. I just didn't see it. So this book I dove into it to really lay out those connections because I had ignored it myself.
Yeah. So we'll talk first broad picture and then nail out some of the specifics too. So, I mean, maybe there's not a specific time marker, but from like about when to obviously you're still doing now, have you been researching, looking, interviewing on far right ideology and kind of we'll call it like the crisis of masculinity?
Yeah, I would say I started studying far right ideology around 2000, like 99, 2000, 2001, when I landed in Germany for that field work. That at that period of time, I thought I was studying originally like democracy, but I ended up studying the far right because that's what was happening in the schools. And so I came to understand far right and how teachers were trying to combat it at that time. And that's the lens through which I understood it. Then the misogyny stuff, I mean, I always was a little interested in gender because I studied boys and men who were on the fringes of violence. And I wanted to understand how they were violent. But I never really asked them about misogyny itself. So, which I understand, by the way, and this is the super nerdy part of what I promised you.
Yeah.
So, I use the definition of misogyny that is from a philosopher named Kate Mann, which says misogyny is the law enforcement arm of the patriarchy. So the patriarchy is upheld as a system of power distribution, and it's upheld by two pillars. One is sexism, which is a set of attitudes that says men and women are unequal for various reasons. And then the other, so sexism is one, and the other is misogyny. Misogyny is a law enforcement arm. It's gender policing. It's policing the expected norms and behaviors, mostly of women, but also of men. And so I think what's really important about that definition is that it's not hatred of women, which is the way that it's colloquially used. It is the policing of behaviors. And that policing can be like belittling or bullying, but it can also be abuse, right? It can be assault or threats or rape threats or domestic abuse for someone who doesn't adhere to being like demure or submissive. And I think that means women can do it as well as men. And it also means that boys suffer from it and men suffer from it, especially when it comes to things like being called a sissy or a fag. Sorry for the slur, but like that's, and so I think women and girls suffer more from it. And I think that's important. But I like that definition because it puts it in a frame where all of us have something to do. We all have a role to play. And it's not just finger wagging at men for bad hatred of women. And so it's like we live in a system where this happens and where everybody plays a role in it. So that's the way I define it.
Okay. So we'll say that I'm again using visuals for those who are on YouTube. They can see this and not just imagine in your head if you need to. We'll call it Venn diagram. We'll say misogyny and far right ideology. How overlapped are they? How much do they differ? Is it like if you're far right, you're misogynist, if you're misogynist, you're far, like what? Yeah. What's that relationship look like?
So I use the term far right to refer to two sort of separate but interrelated sets of issues. One is supremacist thinking, and that is usually white supremacist in our culture and country, but also Western supremacist, like the Proud Boys say. It's male supremacist. It can be Christian supremacist, right? So whatever kind of supremacist thinking that defends a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority in which one group is inherently better. And in some cases, the other group poses a threat, right? So when you get really far right, you're starting to look at an us versus them way of thinking in which the other group, immigrants, people of color, whomever, are an existential threat to your people and have to be eliminated. The other set of things that are far right are sort of anti-democratic ideas like rejection of the rule of law. We see that's where the unlawful militias, sovereign citizens fit in and that kind of stuff. So you can have, and so on the one hand, I would say where misogyny fits in is in the supremacist part of it, right? Wherever you have a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority, and so there's certain kinds of gendered norms and expectations that have to be defended, so that men are men and women are women, and the gender binary comes into that, right? All of that kind of stuff is in the supremacist realm. So I would say in most of the research I've seen, the unlawful militia side of things is also pretty misogynist. There's a lot of like talk about the sissification of cities, and you have to come back to rural town, right? Like that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so be a real man, and so I think,
Femme-coded or beta
yeah,
or whatever it is. Yeah.
right, exactly. So it's pretty clear that it's also misogynist, but I would say it's like really very clear when it comes to the supremacist side of thinking.
Okay, gotcha. So we've actually already talked to, by the time this comes, our first episode, we're recording on February 16th. This will come out in a month or so. We talked with David French of New York Times on far right ideology, and he had some interesting stuff to say about far right and the rights. You can say the right left political spectrum. I'm curious we both use far right. Are they on that like left right spectrum? Is it like they're so far extreme to the right, or is it something different that they're not quite right as in the conservative value? Because the way they're
Yeah.
talking today does not sound conservative in the like 80s 90s conservative speak at all.
Yeah. Yeah. So, like, one of the things I like, so the terms far right and far left are always imperfect and problematic in their own way. And the idea that there's just one single spectrum or a line, right? It's more like clusters that, again, if you had a visual that was just like amorphous clusters that are sort of leftist and rightist, and with conservative stuff in the middle, you can see that. But what I think gets confusing is when we use the word extremism, for example, there used to be a way of thinking about extremism as being on the fringes. And so it's outside of the mainstream. So if it's extreme, it's outside the mainstream. But what's happened is that extremist ideas have become part of the mainstream. And so back to the nerdy definitions, we use a definition in my research lab, and I use the definition from a guy named J.M. Berger, who says extremism is an us versus them way of thinking that positions the other as an existential threat that has to be met with suppression or elimination or, sort of occupation. Like you have to control them and get rid of them. And that way of thinking, an us versus them, is very clearly in the political mainstream right now, of the conservative Republican Party, and sometimes comes out on the left in things like, extraordinary threat faced from the right or from the Trump administration. So I think that's where that's the polarization part of it, where it's extreme polarization, us versus them thinking can also create an existential threat, like democracy's dying. Well, yes, it is like in decline. And that kind of can create a sense of urgency that says violence is an acceptable or a valorized solution. And so that's where, it becomes extremely problematic.
Really helpful definitions to kind of hang
Very
your coat
professor,
on.
I know, like
I
the
like
professor
it.
of
This
me.
is this is why we have people like you on the series to teach people like me. And then honestly, this whole series is for me, and then everybody else
Yeah.
just got like they just
Look,
get to
it's an
listen
awesome way to learn, right?
on their own.
Yeah.
So, a question about this. So, starting in 2001, we start researching this, both far right and then extremism and the misogyny. What are like? What are the um, what are the problems that's not that we see in them, but that the far right or extremists or misogynists, what problems do they perceive
Yeah.
societally that they're like,
Yeah.
okay, this like we gotta fix this.
Yeah, this is fascinating because actually, I do spend a lot of time interviewing people in and around the far right. And if you try to get in their heads a little bit, you start thinking, it's sort of how I felt about QAnon. Like, if I actually believed there was a group of people who were secretly plotting to kidnap children and hold them hostage in a
You better
basement
freaking
and
believe I'd do something about it. Yeah.
exactly, right? Like, of course you would. So, you know, so it's a really good question because you can start to understand the mindset when somebody lives in a place where there's such a sense of existential threat that they feel compelled. And a lot of times what you hear is guys like the Oath Keepers or the Three Percenters, like unlawful militias, and also white supremacists describe themselves as taking heroic action. They see themselves as martyrs who are saving their people. So what they feel is there is an existential threat that they're called to act. They often see themselves as setting an example for other people to follow. That's the martyrdom kind of thing. Like they alone are willing to do it, whether especially if they're on the terrorist side of things, like the El Paso terrorist or the Pittsburgh terrorist or Poway shooter. You'll hear these things in their manifestos that they felt they can't. I mean, the Pittsburgh shooter, before he went into that synagogue, and I never named the shooters, by the way, on purpose, so just by the place,
I
he
don't remember
said,
their names, so that's good.
yeah, right. So he said, "Screw your optics, I'm going in." That was a reference to, a kind of debate that happens in the far right about whether violence is the right path forward. It's bad optics, they say. So, and within the far right scene sometimes, so screw your optics, I'm going in. Like he felt like I can't not take action because he believed there was such a threat, because he believed this conspiracy theory that said, in this case, Jews and feminists are conspiring to eradicate white majority societies, replace them with multicultural ones by promoting immigration, abortion, and reducing white birth rates. So that conspiracy theory is motivated so many terrorist actors in
That sounds
Norway.
terrifically modern even today. Like
Right.
you hear people parrot this all over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, then you
abortion,
get that
Jews,
great,
all that
right?
stuff. Yeah, it's
Exactly.
the
The
same thing.
notion of replacement
Yep.
comes in all the time. So you're right. It's like it gets echoed, right? So that's one of the kinds of things. But basically, they have to really believe that. I mean, the Norway shooter is a perfect example. Like he killed 77 children, mostly at a summer camp, kids who were at a summer camp on an island run by a progressive political party. It was like the future of that political party, because he believed that's the best way to eliminate future pro-immigration, politicians. Like how perverted how much do you have to be deep down a rabbit hole to kill children in order to eliminate a future of immigration in which he felt there was going to be Eurabia, like Arab and Muslim
Yep.
people
I've
taking
heard the
over
term.
Europe.
Yep, I've heard the
And
term.
so that's the level of at the extreme fringe and the far right. That's the level. But we now get those same echoes of, the idea of the threat from immigration. You'll have your home again, like the restoration, the replacement of voters by immigrants. All those kinds of echoes that we're getting in mainstream political rhetoric from this administration and from the previous Trump administration too, is very much in line with that same kind of thinking, even though it doesn't mobilize the same exact type of violence.
Yeah. I have two very stupid questions. And I say stupid because they sound really simple, but I've honestly wondered it, and I can't imagine people have not wondered this as well. And I preface this by saying, like, I understand, like you said, the gut of like, okay, I don't want to be replaced either. I don't want to be killed and to be replaced. Like, who wants that to be replaced? And some, but I guess like, why are they worried about that? I don't know
Yeah.
another way of asking the question other than why are they so worried about being replaced?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the questions that's motivated my whole career is like, why is that so threatening? Right? That's the way I think about it. Like, why is, and I think you get the answer when I think it was Elon Musk. Like, you can find you can find the tweet, but there was some sort of, he
Yes.
retweeted something that was like, you know, of course, like, basically, like, there is among a certain subset of white men in particular who
Which is funny
believe
because he's
this.
South African and talking about this about Americans. Like,
Yeah,
I'm not
right.
going to get
This
into the immigration
idea,
like South Africa, but like, you're
yeah,
not
like,
even
wait till you
American.
see what happens. Like, once we're in the minority, the gloves are off. Like, look how minorities have been treated
Right.
by us.
Right.
Like, they're going to come back and get us. So there is this, like, that kind of idea circulates, and this idea that you're going to lose your power, you're going to lose your status, and you're going to be abused potentially by people who are going to seek revenge on you.
Okay. And so further down this rabbit hole, and this is again just because it's honestly finally have somebody to talk to about this, and people could just hear my musings and questions. Um, do they? And I'm trying to think their thoughts. Do they have any historical precedent for like thinking that what their worry is about being replaced is actually founded, and I'm not saying they're right. I'm not
Yeah.
saying
Yeah,
that
yeah.
their
No, I know
ideas are,
what
but
you're
like
asking. Yeah.
like
No,
what gives them any reason to think this is going to happen historically or even just ideologically?
so the real irony is they do use so they use the Native American example as the example. So
Interesting. Okay.
you'll hear this as like so the El Paso shooter used that example. I've heard German politicians on the right, the conservative right, use this example saying we don't want to end up on reservations like Native Americans did, right? And so we heard that from the El Paso shooter, this idea that native born Americans are going to end up on reservations because immigrants are going to take over and push white people onto reservations. Like they are using the genocide, of Native Americans as the cautionary tale, saying this has happened before, it'll now happen to us, but also claiming somehow like racial entitlement to this land that, even though white people pushed out the original inhabitants of the land. So there's a tremendous irony, but that is the cautionary tale that's often raised by far right, both fringe actors and politicians.
Okay. And now just another stupid, obvious question, but honestly, I just don't know. Why are they so worried about Jews? I honestly
Yeah,
just don't get it. And I think a lot of people are like, Jews have always been like the oppressed. There's very
yeah,
rarely been a situation where they've been the oppressors. Although they say something about Hitler and the Jews and trying to take over German economy and German identity and
yeah.
German Christian nationalism. So what, like, what
Yeah,
is the absolute obsession with Jews
it's
taking over?
so interesting. So I had this whole conversation with Amy Spitalnik on a podcast that I did in association with my book. So that's a podcast called Man Up. So you might be able to clip
Okay,
in this part
perfect.
from her where she explained. So Amy Spitalnik was the executive director of Integrity First for America, which sued the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville under those trials. So she knows a lot about, and now she runs one of the largest Jewish Council for Policy Affairs, it's called. She's the executive director. So she talks a lot about anti Semitism, but also really understands white supremacist extremism. So she's she might be interesting to have on at some point too.
I would
But
love to. Yes.
yeah, so she explained this to me saying that, you know, basically anti-Semitism, as we understand it in the lab too, it's like the beginning or the end point of pretty much every piece of
Yep.
propaganda online. You either start with the Jews or you end with the Jews. And she explains it as a punching up conspiracy, right? So it's that you basically have everybody else. So, like, the perfect example is the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, where Jews and feminists are conspiring together. Really, like, feminists are being blamed for white birth rates declining and for, abortion and reproductive rights. But the idea is they couldn't have possibly done it themselves because they're women. So someone else, right? So someone else must actually be controlling them. And that must be the Jews. So it's a punching up conspiracy theory. And that extends to everybody else. Like immigrants couldn't possibly be conspiring to replace white civilizations. African Americans couldn't possibly be, right? So it's this,
They're all too
they're
dumb, so they must be the Jews to do it.
exactly, right? So because scientific racism, part of the conspiracy theories, say that Jews are smarter than, so they actually have higher, on this biological, like the intelligence side. This is a
So is it sort of
conspiracy.
like the stereotype a lot of Asian people get or Chinese people get, where
Yes,
immigrants
exactly.
did?
It's like
Okay,
that,
I
except
see.
it's also tied to all these old conspiracy theories that have been around for centuries about Jews and blood libel and these just absurd conspiracy theories about adrenochrome and taking blood from children in order to gain power. And so that stuff feeds into QAnon too, and the anti-Semitic nature. So it's all false, age-old conspiracies. But ultimately, that I think the way Amy explains it is like the simplest way to understand it, that Jews are seen as smarter and in control as the puppet masters, if you will. That's the orchestration of everybody else. So it's the punching up conspiracy theory compared to the punching down of everyone else.
Okay, because that also plays into, and again, I would love to see what you say about this, and I would love to get connected with her. I have
Yeah,
so
happy to.
many questions about
Yeah.
anti-Semitism and white supremacy and Christian nationalism. Um, but it also makes sense of like current debate-ish kind of thing? Because Elon's playing into this now with the Holocaust narrative and the re-narrativization of a Holocaust narrative. Um, has that always been in kind of white supremacist slash like far right stuff? Is that newer? Has that more like what's that relationship been like?
Yeah, so there's always been, there's always been like several different dimensions within white supremacist ideology around Jewishness and around the Holocaust. So you have factions of white supremacists who they call it the Jewish question, who like, are Jews white or not, right? And so there's that whole question, right? So
Yeah.
like they get into like the racial and religious intersections. And then there's like Holocaust denialism and Holocaust minimization, and those things intersect. And so you have some white supremacists who will say the Holocaust happened, but it really wasn't that bad, or Hitler had good ideas, they just didn't get executed well, or he went too far, right? He just went too far, but if he had just stopped with his plan to ship everybody to Madagascar, which is like the
I've
remigration, right?
heard that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Like if he had just, he just stopped with that, that would have been okay. That's remigration, which is, something a word that we now hear being
Yep.
used
We
in
hear
the
it from the
Department of
freaking
Homeland
government right
Security.
now. Yeah.
Right. So that's the idea. It's like, but then you actually have like real Holocaust deniers too, who believe it didn't exist. It's a conspiracy theory. It's a Hollywood made up story, that kind of stuff. So that, you get that kind of stuff circulating as well. And a lot of minimization in youth culture that kind of makes light of it by, with pizza oven memes and right stuff that just like jokes. Those same, I describe that kind of stuff as like the way that I grew up, in central Pennsylvania, like using a slur for gypsies as a word for getting cheated, that I had no idea until I was a full on adult had any reference back. The word gypped, right? I had no idea had any reference to gypsies. And so I think there's a lot of jokes around the Holocaust that some kids say like, oh, it's just a joke. Everybody says that
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
certain,
Yeah. Sure.
they just don't have the historical
That was like the
understanding.
Republican chat that got leaked 6 months ago, whenever it was. They're like, "Oh, those guys are just joking. They don't
Yeah,
really mean
right.
what they're
Just boys
saying."
being boys, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh God. There's you just open up a can of worms, and I have so many worms that I'm trying to grasp at. Um, but so you said something beginning, and this is kind of the meme culture, which is now, I mean, just like it used to be. Maybe I'm young and dumb, and didn't really follow politics until I hit college and after, and didn't like. I had this assumption that like the president was supposed to be or had always been like
Yeah.
pretty professional, and
Yeah.
the accountants that were under his domain or people that he would do to like hire to do it or different departments were professional. And now they're just memeing the story and just having like the
Yeah.
grandest old time ever. um
Yeah.
how like obviously without you don't have to go through the entire history,
Yeah.
but from your time of researching far right ideology and then how they propagandize and then like give a face like how is that morphed and shifted to where now it's like we've talked about it, now it's like the highest levels of government, the president, the chief of staff, department of like the
Yeah.
department of war, department of homeland security, like all of these accounts now like they're just memeing and that's all they're ever
Yeah.
doing.
Totally. You know, oddly, I saw a lot of this starting when I was in Germany in around 2002, 2003, 2004. These companies came on the market to sell products, clothing first, to high quality clothing to teenagers that had basically Nazi signs and symbols encoded in other ways, right? So it was like a shift in iconography because swastikas were banned. And so this is pre-social media. This is, practically pre-internet. I mean, it's around, but you don't have the visual internet in the same way. But it was high quality clothing, that was the death of the skinhead, is the way researchers describe it. Like the whole skinhead scene disappeared and was replaced with a wide variety of brands of high quality clothing that embedded coded symbols in them and iconography that escaped school dress codes, stadium dress codes, police authorities, right? And so there was this game playing culture to it that was also like full of humor. So you'd see things like a little fox on a t-shirt that had the word Wustenfuchs under it, which is the nickname for, Desert Fox for Erwin Rommel, who commanded the Nazi troops in North Africa. Everyone of a certain age would know that nickname but it's just a little picture of a fox, and it's like kind of a nice t-shirt.
Like
And
you said, it's
so
kind of like that dog whistle. If you know it, you know it. But if you don't know it, you're not going to
exactly,
catch it.
right? And so that totally changed the scene. And that created this whole culture of like towing the line with authorities. So they would take the vowels out of a word that was banned, like the word for swastika, and then all the words started losing their vowels, right? Because the courts ruled a word is not a word if the vowels are removed. Like just wild stuff, right? Like
Yeah.
this constant back and forth. And so, and then, that went on for a while. And then meme culture, you started seeing that evolve into memes, like basically. And then instead of waiting for someone to produce the symbols, right, that you then had to pay money for, now it's organic, it's bottom up. You're an active producer of the symbols, and you can quickly take Pepe the Frog and put him into, a
I was
Holocaust
this
image
close
or
from saying Pepe the Frog after you
right,
said that. You
exactly.
took the word
So
right out
you
of my
take
mouth.
something like Pepe the Frog, and then you take Pepe the Frog and turn him into a mythical ethnic homeland called Kekistan, because there's an Egyptian god of the frogs named Kek, and so you decide Pepe's Lord Kek, right? All of that, and then that produces a whole fantastical meme with a Kekistan flag that is this
Yeah.
sort of mythical white
This is that
ethnicity.
Groyper War of 2015, 2016
Exactly,
that
right?
helped
Exactly.
Trump.
And then the Groypers actually start showing up, right, to
They actually
protest
do a
at
lot of
church.
stuff. Yeah,
Right.
they very legitimately like almost helped Trump get elected.
Exactly. And that Kyrgyzstan flag was waving at Charlottesville. It was waving on January 6th at the US Capitol, right? Like it shows up in places where there are episodes of violence. And so, it's like, and they started referring to themselves as meme war veterans, right? Like you see t-shirts that say meme war veteran, right?
Yeah.
You get something like the Boogaloo come out around that time, which is an even weirder meme that was a reference to a coming second civil war, again created by teenagers online, that to mean the second of something, and then it became the second civil war. And suddenly it's like Boogaloo groups are being shut down by Facebook because they're calling for a coming civil war. And I think like 5 police officers were killed by Boogaloo guys in the summer of 2020. They were partly responsible for the kidnapping plot and execution plot against Governor Gretchen Whitmer. So, you know, these, and it's really hard for people who at that time in the national security space were looking at like ISIS type, chains of command,
They're
like what's the
so far
cell,
behind on this stuff.
right? Exactly. They're like, what's the chain of command? Like I'd be in a room trying to explain this, and
It
I'm
was
like,
like that Senate hearing on Facebook back in like
yes, right,
2017, 2018.
exactly. And you're just
These
like,
80-year-old dudes who like have no clue what's going on the internet.
yeah, and we're seeing that right now on this other side of things, like out of the misogyny. We're just tracking like clavicular, and this, which New York Times just ran a whole cover story on him. This guy who is using a ton of lingo from the looks maxing community, which is like this, right? And that originally came out of incel culture, which originally came out of pickup artist culture,
I'm
and
reading
somehow
the
now,
original book from Rollo Tomasi right now.
right, and now somehow is like got used in a North Carolina Senate run ad, like the same, saying he was
Yep,
vote
I
maxing,
know
and
exactly who
like
the guy is. Yeah,
and like he's a like compared to his low tier candidate, like that's incel language,
it
right? Like,
very much is. Yeah,
and you're like, I'm watching it. We're like watching it
high value,
live.
low value, AFCs,
Yes,
PUAs,
exactly. And
all
you're
that
like,
stuff.
oh
Yeah,
my God, how did this happen? It happened so fast, right? Like it was fringe, and then suddenly it's like mainstream, because this streamer who makes $100,000 a month, right, with like promoting these ideas, has gone a little viral. And candidates are trying so hard to reach young men. They're trying so hard to reach young men that they're just, pulling these bits of vocabulary and ideas. So that's one thing. And then the second thing I would say is that really all of that taken together is what I called, from around 2015 onward, this sort of weaponization of youth culture that allowed the far right at that time, especially, to position itself as the counterculture against a boring, triggered mainstream that just couldn't take a joke. And so they really effectively used like humor and satire and irony and jokes. And it's been very hard for, been very hard to combat that and not feel like it's just a stick in the mud, person who doesn't think anything's funny. And so everything is irony, everything is, and that eventually becomes a little nihilistic too.
yeah. So for the uninitiated slash me, who I'm a little thick headed, and so sometimes this stuff doesn't come across like when you look at this stuff from the far right, from the extremists, whatever it may be, from misogynists, whether intentional, unintentional, imbibed, unimbibed, whatever it may be, um, from these, like, what are they trying to communicate? Are they trying to be stupid and funny? Are they trying to be serious? Are they trying to like, what's the intention behind the messages, the memes? What are their like? What are their
I
end
think
goals? Are they just trying to be like stupid and funny and try to get a lot of likes? Or are they actually trying to communicate something that kind of gets like over the heads of us who are looking at it too literally?
Yeah, I think it's both. And that's what's sort of confusing because I think there are some guys, I'm going to say guys because mostly guys, but there is this whole
Yep.
subset of young women who are
I'm
doing
getting to
it
that
too, right?
question.
So,
Yep.
like, yeah. So, some of them are just there for the laughs or they're there, to make money. And so, really, this is where you get like an Andrew Tate kind of guy who says, has defended himself as just an actor, like playing a bit part, right? Like it almost doesn't matter because it's the way I think about Trump in that first that debate where years ago where he said the thing, Proud Boys stand back, stand by. Like nobody will ever know what he actually meant by that. He might not even know what he actually meant by that, right?
Good
But
point.
because who knows? But what we do know is that within 12 hours, the Proud Boys were selling T-shirts that said that, right? Like they took it as a call to action. And so I think there is this like intention versus like, an impact kind of thing or the way it's received. And so I think there are a fair number of people that are just selling stuff, like really profiteers, whether they're looking for votes or they're looking to actually sell a subscription to something or a product or a course, who maybe don't even believe the ideology or only a little, but are just profiting off of it. But then there's also like people who really, Richard Spencer, others at that time who were strong ideologues. And I think there are ideologues today who are taking advantage of that. And then, people who are just trying to reach young men as voters who are inadvertently, I think, like, you know, using the looks maxing kind of, for example, as an example, like I'm not crazy about seeing like incel terminology get, validated as the idea that there's like beta and alpha men or high tier and low tier, high value, low value men, like based on how they look. I don't like those messages going out to boys and young men. And to see candidates take advantage of that to try to appeal to young men is a little disturbing. So, you can see that appropriation of it intentionally in that case, which is, and I would call that misogynistic. That is the policing of boys and young men's appearance and the expectations of what they look like as an alpha male.
Yeah. So I'm gonna ask a question. I don't know how our audience is gonna take this, but we've had a running theory behind Sons of Patriarchy, and so this is gonna go into the next question. But I want to preface it with this one, and maybe even this is not gonna make it into the interview itself. We're so curious. Kind of to I don't know another way to put it, like the latent homosexuality. Like there's the obsession, and I'm playing some stereotypes here, and I fully recognize that, and some probably unhelpful tropes. But I don't know how else to ask the question other than it sometimes can seem like there's some stuff that's being repressed there
Oh,
that they're not.
totally. Yeah.
They're kind of covering up with like, no, I'm a man, I'm gonna do all these masculine things, but it's like they're just like they're glazed, like they're trying to like lift each other up in some what can sound like homoerotic terms, like
Yeah.
the Chad, the looks like. I mean,
Yeah.
if
I
you talk
think,
to average heterosexual man, like it's just not something that they
yeah.
talk about typically.
Yeah. Yeah. So, it can be, I think there's a couple different ways to see this. One is it could be like repressed homosexuality or repressed feelings for other guys or something like that. I also think it's a reflection of how policed masculinity is. And so my favorite study that I cite in Man Up, just to get nerdy again, is a study by Joel Middleman Levin, sociologist who interviewed high school boys and in the U.S. And he found that this generation of high school boys increasingly doesn't really care who their friends have sex with, like if they're having same-sex relationships or not, as long as they're bro about it. And so, like,
Interesting.
basically, the title, and I'm going to use a slur to because they use it. It's like it's okay to be gay. It's not okay to be a fag. So like they have, you can have sex with whoever you want as long as you're not effeminate about it or flamboyant about it.
Huh.
And right. And so
That's
what I
very
take
different
away,
than how I grew up.
right? Totally, right? And so, but what I take away from that is that for this generation of young men, sexuality is increasingly more fluid, but masculinity is as policed as ever. And so, right? And so it could be that that this is like homophobic at homosexual repression at its root, but it also could be, I think that, what one man described to me who I interviewed was like, that he had spent his entire adolescence like slicing off parts of himself to survive a gauntlet of what was actually homophobic bullying from other boys. Like, you can't be too soft, have to be dominant and aggressive and ready to be violent and don't ask for help and all this stuff. And then he kind of pops out in his 20s and he's annoyed now that people are telling him he's got like toxic masculine traits, right? Like, he's like, that was my survival strategy and now you're telling me it's toxic. And so I think there's that, right? Like, a lot of the boys and men I interview and talk to say, how much pressure they feel from other boys, how much homophobic bullying there is, the things they're called, whatever, like you play like a girl just constantly in in-game chats. And so I do think that there's this expression of hyper masculinity that comes from some of that for some of these guys, which is, wanting to be dominant because that's what they've been taught is the thing to be. And so this is the thing they're embracing. And then all that lingo around sexual market value and, how to make yourself have a better score on the marketplace to get it, all of that just feeds into it, right? The whole dating scene and the online dating scene.
That is fascinating. I need to look way. We have had so many questions, and
Yeah, I know
that
we went off
helps.
down like a rabbit hole there, but
Yeah, no,
I love that study.
that really helps with some of this. So now, similar to a question I asked before, we're trying to ask this question more often in this new weekly series because we are trying to sympathetically sort of, but also just like talk to the right and say like, hey, we we may not understand, but we're trying to figure out like what is it that you're looking for and what is it that you think you're getting from these communities. So I'll ask like what is sold to men in these communities, in these online communities, in these pickup communities, in these alpha male, Tate, whatever communities. What is sold to men? But I'm going to preface it by saying what is sold to men that's like actually sort of true, but then the response or solution is not just unhelpful but hurtful, but they just don't see that yet because they're so interested. And actually, you're asking the question I'm asking right now. I don't really care about the solution later on. I have that question. I'm going to join this
Yeah.
community.
Yeah. Okay. So I think there's like two sets of things. One that I hear from young men in and around far right scenes over the years. One is particularly when there's a group involved, like if it's an unlawful militia or a neo-Nazi group or something like that, they almost always describe what they get out of it in positive terms, even though it's actually directed toward of hate toward others. What they talk about is brotherhood, belonging. You never walk alone. Someone always has your back. You never feel left behind, right? So this counter to what we're talking about of isolation, of lack of meaning, of lack of purpose, lack of agency, all the things that a lot of young men are suffering from right now of disconnection, disaffection, inability to thrive, basically, right? Because of the structure of our system and too much time online, but also not real efficacy in the way they live their lives right now because of affordability crises, but also changing labor market conditions, higher depression, isolation,
Heard,
right?
the number one driver right now of the crisis masculinity is economic conditions.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so on the one hand, they get something out of it that's really effectively positive. Like they belong to a tribe and they know what's right and what's wrong, and they're gonna fight for it. And they're gonna fight for it alongside other people who they're not gonna let down. And they're part of something. So I think that's one part of it. On the other side, that's the kind of like in physical, in person groups, I would say. I really hear that a lot. In particular, the online communities, that is, I think, similarly related to, but a little more nihilistic of some of this is rooted in just feeling like everything sucks and there's no pathway forward, and there's so much scapegoating and fear mongering for what are actually real and perceived grievances. So that, and a lot of times you get influencers who actually just offer those scapegoats to them, right? It's women, it's feminists, it's Jews. These are the people to blame. And then that can open up whole rabbit holes. So it's both kinds of things, but there is a scapegoat and somebody who's being blamed for your problems. But in the other case, it's also like you're fighting for something, and I do really understand that feeling like you want to be a part of something bigger and better than yourself, and that's a lot of what I have heard from young men over the years.
Yeah, and this may not be part of your expertise, but since you wrote a book on men and
Yeah,
and our issues and what we're looking for and what we're being sold and the rabbit holes we're going down, um, especially on the isolation issue, has that because the isolation, I guess, and I mean, I was born in 91, so some of this stuff is like I was born into a lot of the social media stuff, the rise of the internet. In high school was when Facebook came out for me. I didn't know how to use it until I was in college. Um, but that's not I'd assume that's not the case for people who came before me, men who came before me, wherein like if you wanted to hang out with guys, like you couldn't go on the internet. And so the only way that you could is if you went to a specific place that was predetermined. You talk to your friends, hey, we'll meet here at whatever time, or you meet your
yeah,
girlfriend, whatever
yeah.
time. Um, is this like, do you see this phenomena before kind of millennials and Gen Xers, or has this always been the case, or is this more particularly so in this current generation?
Yeah, so loneliness is like worse than it's ever been, basically. I think that, and that's for boys and for girls, young men and women, like it's bad across the board. I think what happens to young men is that loneliness gets weaponized by people online and by online explanations for why they're lonely. They're lonely because girls and women are transactional. They will only date a certain, they're manipulative. They only are going to want you if you're an alpha guy, and you have to be you have to get your shins lengthened or your jaws, you got to
Yep.
bone smash, right? All the
Yep.
stuff, right? Like all the
Yep.
things. And
I'm
so,
reading all that stuff right now, so I'm in the thick of it.
yeah, and so I think, so there's always been loneliness. But I also think that like the experience of being online can make people feel somehow connected, but they're actually not connected, right? Because they're in some sort of online community, and you're spending time, and you're, as one guy I interviewed this summer said, you just end up like scrolling and scrolling till whatever, right? Like
Yeah,
you suddenly
that's
feel
all
like,
Jonathan Haidt's research for Anxious Generation.
yeah,
He
right.
goes
Like
way
all of a
into
sudden
this.
you're like, oh my God, where did that hour go? Where did those 2 hours go? And so, you might not feel, you're not bored. Like my generation was bored all the time, right? Like,
Mine transitioned from like we were still bored when social media came in, and we're like, I don't really know how this works. This is kind of
yeah,
dumb. I'll still go outside, but I'll still use it
right.
sometimes.
Yeah, like we were bored all the time as a young adult. Like my first job, like waiting for the bus, waiting for the metro, waiting for the subway. Like you had nothing to do. You would bring out a book, maybe a magazine, but mostly you just sat around and stared at other people and were bored, right? Like
Yeah.
we were bored. And so I think this generation is not bored, right? Like I'm, even myself, like I'm rarely bored anymore because you're constantly trying to do something, or you have your phone right there and you can always read something, scroll something. And so you're not bored. And so because you're not bored, you're not seeking connection. You're not seeking, you're not observing other people as much. And so that just kind of feeds into, then you actually feel more lonely, right? Because then when you stop scrolling and scrolling, you're like, there's not actually anybody there. And so that's, I think, a lot of what we're feeling. And then that scapegoating of who's to blame for it being about the way the dating marketplace works, particularly for young guys, I think is one of those harmful things.
So now is when I want to ask about the women in these like just
Yeah.
straight up misogynistic communities, and we've asked a few other women on who are coming on the series, and we're gonna ask more and ask other men as well. Um, why? What's
Yeah.
I don't know how, like they're like they have to know they're gonna be treated this way. Like what
Yeah.
have you seen from women joining this? What is their role? What are they told? What's their like?
Yeah.
What's their
Okay.
let's talk about
So
this.
so yeah, there's a couple different things. I mean, there's different like just like there is within the so-called manosphere, like there's which is a collection of blogs and forums, and the same thing within the sometimes it's called the femosphere or the womanosphere, like depending on what you're
Yeah.
talking about, right? There's
Yep.
different like so there's all different gradations. There's women there who really are like out to get men and running, they're really like there's women um uh who are promoting, trad wife content that is promoting a submissive way of being where, the man should be in control, should be supporting you, and you should be kind of like demure, so mindful, to name one trend from the summer that got co-opted from a trans influencer, but is like then became this kind of this is a pathway to have the soft life, be a kept wife, right? That kind of content. And so I think there's a couple things. One, in the most sympathetic reading for me, I would say uh, it's back to the economic conditions too. Like it's a very very difficult time. I mean, it was hard for my generation, right? Like to think of the cost of childcare is impossible. The cost of education. I mean, of having a family and trying to think about how you make that work. I mean, for me, I had kids. My salary was less than our childcare expenses for the first several years, right? Like that's ridiculous. Like I only sustained that because I thought eventually I'll get tenure or I won't. It'll work itself out, but I'll make more money someday, right? But it was like but that's an absurd calculation for a lot of women who are already earning less than men probably in their lives, and then they might have pursued a career like teaching or something else, a caregiving career typically that's not paying very well. And so why would you keep doing that, right? And so it becomes impossible. Then you're juggling, you're exhausted. The conditions are just really bad. And so I can see why. And I've heard young women say this, like, I want a life like that. Why wouldn't I want to have like a peaceful, beautiful kitchen, look beautiful and made up, and be making my gumballs in the morning, right? Like, I mean, what's not to like? But on some level it's not realistic, but it's still appealing to something that says your life can be simpler. You don't have to hustle. You don't have to hustle in this capitalist culture that's not looking out for you. You can take care of your family and be there. And it's playing into some of those own stereotypes and misogynistic ideas about your own norms and expectations as a nurturer and a caregiver and a someone who wants that. A lot of women want that, and that's okay. And so I think that's the most sympathetic read. Another thing that's interesting about it, though, is that there is some evidence showing that the largest tradwife accounts, up to 85% of the followers are not women, they're men. And so that says to me that what they're also curating is a fantasy for some men about what they want, which is the ability to provide for a
Yeah,
family,
they're
a
not.
wife who's going to
Most of them
take
are
care
not
of
going
them.
after women. They're going after men who say, "You want
Right.
a woman like me?" Like whatever it is, like doing whatever it is I'm
Exactly,
doing.
right? Subscribe. And so there is also a profiteer component to that. And then the third thing I would just say is like some women are just down the rabbit hole, like, and totally believe that whether it's biblical patriarchy, whether it's like whatever it is, they actually just really, really believe that, or maybe wouldn't admit it, but believe it on some deeper level, that it's the right place for them to be in the home morally, religiously, that their correct role is to be subservient to a husband who should have the final say and should be the head of household. And I think there's less of that than there used to be, but there's still plenty of people who are raised in those environments for whom at 20, 21, 22, 23, a lot of these young women influencers really haven't experienced a world where they maybe would change their minds about that.
Yeah, there's something to like there's a vision or a promise or blessing sold to them is that if you take these characteristics, if you have this many kids, if you do this for your husband, that equals this kind of life. These like the lesser
Right. It's
or the
virtuous,
yeah.
right? As virtuous and as God given and natural, right? Those are the kinds of things like that it can be very hard to fight against if you grow up in an environment where you're taught to believe that is how you are worthy as a person. And so I think that's a lot of what you see is like those little, echoes of that kind of belief system, which comes through in a lot of our culture, Hallmark movies, whatever, right? Same kind of stuff, the princess rescue scenarios, right? Like a lot of that kind of stuff. And it's not always there, but, and what the evidence shows is that the trad wife stuff is not actually reflected in the way that young women pursue careers or what they want, but it represents some sort of fantasy, for both men and for some women, for some men and for some women, about what a simpler life could be like, where everybody had their very clear roles.
Yeah, and in some sense, like the simpler life does, like really. At some point, it's like you have a really like if you have a really complex life in a really
Yes.
complex world, which is what we live in. A simple life sounds
Yeah.
incredible.
You're exhausting, you're juggling, you're trying to pick up your sick kids from childcare and backup care, right? Like, of course, like, why wouldn't you just want to have like a pot of stew simmering on the stove? I mean, I can think of a million reasons why that sounds exhausting too, but like,
Exactly.
right, but I can see why the fantasy of it feels like a salve against a very complicated world.
Yeah. Yep. So I caught something you said in the middle of this, and this is where not necessarily end the conversation, but start landing the plane of this. The difference between the online kind of far right
Yeah,
communities and the in-person far right communities. I think there's, I mean, I'll pitch this to. Is it like I think the general sentiment is you start online and online radicalizes you, and then you go from online radicalization into in-person stuff. That's where you become a hardcore racist, anti-Semite. That's where like Charlottesville happens. Like that, there's this there's this belief that there's a funnel from
yeah.
online stuff into like is that how it works or is it different?
It's different than that, I would say. It's not just a funnel. That might be one pathway. What I would say is there's just like a lot of different pathways. So
Yeah.
that's one. But,
It's like the
when you,
simplistic funnel of it's like, well, don't start here because if you start here,
yeah,
this is the road that you're gonna go down.
yeah, that's true. There is a little bit of funnel in the sense that I think of it as like off ramps are still possible. Like there's many places where you can intervene with a young person who's starting down a rabbit hole or a pathway that can lead to an joining a neo-Nazi group or an unlawful militia or something like that, right? So there are those in-person groups. And it's also the case that like every single terrorist attack we've had from the far right in the US, going all the way back to Oklahoma City, every single terrorist attack that was successfully executed, not a plot that was interrupted, is at the hands of someone who was not a member of a group. So,
Huh.
all of those guys were radicalized by propaganda that was produced in part by groups or circulated by members of groups online or in pamphlets, in the case of Oklahoma City back in 95. But, it's not like the KKK, right? Which was its own, right? Like where you really had to be invited into a group. There were initiation rites. All the actions took place in person. There's manifestos. There's, right. You have that. You have the Proud Boys doing that kind of stuff too, but you also have the Proud Boys harassing people online. So there are groups. That is one pathway. But I think there's some statistics, different databases show it differently. Like somewhere between 7 and 15% of violent far right extremist actions are at the hands of groups. Or someone who is affiliated with a group. The rest of it is just an individual taking action based on, and sometimes we call those lone wolves, but I don't really like that term either because it implies that they're not networked. They may be well networked online into these online
They're
communities
just
of
not
people who
officially
are
part of something.
egging them on, exactly. Or they're like, what we're seeing much more commonly now is even messier than that are actions that are taken at the hands of someone who's like incubating in really harmful and hateful ideas, anti-Semitism, racism, misogyny, but then targets something totally different, like an elementary school or a parade in Highland Park, right? So that kind of stuff is very hard to explain based on a clear ideology. The intelligence community calls it signal noise, but I call it sort of muddiness or blurry ideologies where the hateful ideas are part of the story, but in the end, what they wanted was violence, and violence in the most despicable way, usually against children or parade goers or someplace innocent.
Okay. So now finishing up, um what are some ways you see these communities described or deconstructed or critiqued that you're like, hey, I see what you're doing.
Yeah.
but it's not right. And let me help you figure out whether it be like unhelpful tropes or too simplistic or maybe too complex. What are some of those things you see most often? You're like, I get the intention, but it's just like that's not going to
Yeah.
be as helpful as you think of this.
I think that like one of the things that people make a mistake of is describing the far right as stupid, or as like ignorant thugs, right? Like this isn't actually usually about ignorance. It's about having been persuaded, and persuaded by a worldview that can be a manipulative worldview, it can be propaganda, it can be conspiracy theories, it's harmful content. But smart people, smart and good people with values, fall for propaganda, fall for conspiracy theories, often because they have a desire to help. They want to be in service to their country as a veteran still, and so then they're drawn into some group that's telling them, you're going to defend the Constitution, it's under threat, right? That's one of the major ways that some of the militia members get drawn in. And so I think you get this common idea that these are just stupid thugs who, if we only just had better education in general, and we do need better history education. We do need, a lot of critical thinking skills, etc. But it's not a one-to-one. Like, being an educated parent actually doesn't make you any more likely to recognize online manipulation tactics that your kids might be exposed to in our research. In fact, it can make you worse at it because you're so arrogant as an overeducated parent that
Yeah.
what we
And
find
you
is
might
people
only look
think,
for specific things when it may be
yeah,
more
they think
insidious
they
than
don't
that.
need it. They think their kids won't need it. They don't think their kids could be susceptible to it. So I think it's what I often say is it's more kind of media and digital literacy that we need, that is about recognizing and rejecting harmful online manipulation and the content that comes to you from someone trying to profit off of you in some way, to be more skeptical, of the media you consume. And that's something everybody needs. Elderly people need it to not fall for IRS scams.
Yep.
Kids need it to not fall for sextortion scams, right? And I mean, it's all kinds of people who fall for harmful manipulation, and some of that is propaganda and hateful propaganda.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, um, first I want to see if there's anything that you want to add to this, and then also to plug wherever people can find you, your books. I mean, we talked about some of this stuff on the front end before the recording, but where can people find you, your work, what you're working on, what you're
Yeah,
interested in, but also anything that you'd like to end this episode on that's particularly on your mind or that's you're
yeah.
like currently researching.
I would just say, I run a research lab called Peril, the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. We're now like 35 people across the country who work to create tools and an evidence-based that's free. So all the tools are free. So you can, maybe in the show notes, put perilresearch.com, tools to help parents, teachers, mental health counselors, faith leaders, and others, adults in the lives of young people, recognize what their kids' lives are like online and know how to help them reject harmful content. And we also do a lot of short form video that directly teaches how to recognize manipulative content. And I bring that up to say, one, that there are tools out there for communities, and two, that there's an evidence base that you can prevent people from being persuaded by that kind of content if you get to them before they believe it. And that's the trick. Like, it's much harder to pull somebody back out of the rabbit hole than it is to prevent them from going down it to begin with. So it's a sense of urgency for communities who really say, hey, this is about safety, it's about safeguarding, and it helps protect people from scams, but also manipulation and propaganda. So, I think that's the main thing I would say. People can find me through the website perilresearch.com. I have my own website, cynthiamiller-idriss.com, with essays. I do a lot of public writing. I'm on book tour still right now, so they can find me out and about. I've got 10 more stops this spring, so depending on when this runs, they'll be finding me in LA or in North Carolina, Georgia, and Pittsburgh, and a bunch of other cities around the country. So hopefully I'll see people out on the road, and happy to answer questions, if they come up through the emails associated with those websites.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the series and talking about your research and your interests, and also just stuff that are, I mean, not just ethereal and sometimes, but like actually hitting us right now square in the face. And what do we do about this? So thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for tolerating all the nerdy definitions.
You're welcome.